In today's deep dive, we're going to speak about the hate crime laws that have author J.K. Rowling telling her 14 million followers that she should be arrested. The laws aim to protect people against hate crimes, but they've also attracted some criticism, both in Scotland and across the world. Last week, new laws came into effect in Scotland, and they're aiming to target hate speech specifically. Under the new laws, it's illegal to incite hate against people based on age, disability, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, transgender identity, or for being intersex. Now, it's fair to say that the new laws have attracted quite a fair bit of criticism. So, Sam, today I wanted to go through the laws, what they are, what they're aiming to achieve, the passage of the legislation, it's been a hot minute, and what people are saying about it.
And are these laws new to Scotland and the UK? Like, is this the first time they've had hate laws, or is there a bit of a history there?
No. So, that's a two-pronged question. So to answer it, firstly, no, it's not a new law. So this legislation was actually passed back in 2021. It's taken until now for it to come into effect, though. So that's why we're talking about it today. These laws also aren't the first time that hate crimes have been legislated in Scotland. So that's happened before.
Right.
Inciting racial hatred has been outlawed across the UK, including Scotland, since 1986. However, there was a 2018 review of hate crime legislation, and that found that Scotland's laws were outdated, that they needed reviewing and needed updating. That review called for hate crime regulations to be strengthened and to be expanded.
So give me a sense of how many hate crimes there were in Scotland.
Yeah, look, I think that this is like an imperfect science to talk about. We know with any kind of reporting on crime that there's a lot that goes unreported. We can only go off what is publicly available. In Scotland, we know that in 2022 to 2023, there were 5,738 charges related to hate crimes. Again, it's also kind of hard to compare this to other jurisdictions because there are differences in the way that people report things, obviously difference in what hate crimes
is defined as.
Exactly. But I guess as a point of comparison, in the Republic of Ireland, which has a similar sized population, in 2022, there were 582 hate crimes reported. So there's a fairly big difference there between Scotland and Ireland. But if we go back to Scotland for a second, so as I said, the Parliament passed this legislation in 2021, and what it did was specifically outlaw inciting hate against people based on the following categories. And I named them before, but I just want to go through it slowly again. Age, disability, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, transgender identity, or being intersex. So it explicitly added those, it's called protected classes, of people to the existing racial hatred laws. So that's why we aren't talking about race there. It's because that already existed, and these classes have now been added as well. What you might have noticed is that the laws don't explicitly include women. So women aren't included as a protected class. That's because a government task force recommended separate legislation ensuring protections against misogynistic harassment and abuse. We haven't actually seen that legislation yet, but the government says that it's coming. So they're going to deal with that separately to this hate crime legislation. So now back to the law itself. I think that this is important to understand because I think sometimes it can be fairly subjective what counts as a hate crime. What one person considers a hate crime can arguably not be seen the same by another. So the threshold that the legislation sets out is that a person commits an offence if they communicate material or behave in a manner that, quote, a reasonable person would consider to be threatening or abusive with the intention of stirring up hatred.
It's quite interesting language to put in law.
Stirring up. Yeah. And that's a direct quote. I found it's everywhere and it's such an interesting term. And obviously that there is a penalty attached to if you are found guilty of committing a hate crime, and the maximum penalty there is a prison sentence of 7 years.
Now, typically when we talk about these types of laws, on the other end of the spectrum, there's always people who talk about freedom of speech and how to capture the balance between hate laws and restricting what someone can say and ensuring that people can say what they want in a functioning society.
Yeah.
Did the legislation touch on that tension?
Yeah, it did. So lawmakers who were responsible for creating this legislation say, obviously, because they were responsible for creating it, that it adequately balances free speech with protecting people against hate speech. So they say that this has been achieved in a number of ways. Firstly, if a person is charged with hate crimes and they can prove their actions were reasonable, that counts as a defence.
Right.
The legislation also references the right to freedom of expression that's in the European Convention on Human Rights. That includes the protection of, quote, ideas that offend, shock or disturb. So essentially saying something shocking, just to say something shocking, is under law legally different from saying something that the court finds you would know would incite hatred against a protected group. So
it's not just what you say,
it's a higher
why
threshold.
You say it.
Yeah. So according to the First Minister, who is the leader of Scotland, his name is Humza Yousaf, the law, quote, protects the most vulnerable and marginalised in our society whilst also safeguarding freedom of expression and freedom of speech.
And we'd expect that from the First Minister. His government introduced this law. He's
also worked really closely on it because he was in the Justice portfolio when it actually passed. So he's been like really involved with it the whole way through.
Okay, and so what have his opponents said about this law?
Yeah, so there are a few different camps who oppose it for different reasons. So the first is the Scottish Conservative Party, whose leader Douglas Ross called the legislation dangerous and he labelled it a threat to free speech. Separately, there have also been concerns raised by Scottish police. They said that they were expecting an influx of online abuse complaints. So according to the BBC, and this was given directly to them, police have received more than 3,000 hate crime reports since the new law was introduced on Monday.
Wow.
So a week ago. And just again, to give you a reference, in the whole year of 2022 to 23, there were 5,738 charges.
Okay, and those are charges, 3,000 reports in a couple of days.
We don't know how many of those would ever amount to a charge.
But you'd assume that that's going to overtake that number pretty quick.
Yeah. So that's where some concern from police remains, and the passage of the law and the reason it took so long was so that it would give the police longer to prepare for how they were going to deal with this influx. So that's that. Then there have also been some high-profile critics of the legislation, people including Elon Musk and J.K. Rowling.
Okay, so there have been people who've clicked on this podcast to listen to it because we've got the author of Harry Potter in the title, and this is where she enters the conversation. What have J.K. Rowling and Elon Musk actually said?
So we'll get Elon Musk out of the way first.
Please.
Because, I mean, he hasn't said heaps, but he did weigh in. He said that the laws are an example of why it's so important to preserve freedom of speech. But then J.K. Rowling. And look, she lives in Scotland, so she has a fair bit to do with this legislation. Yeah. And she's had a lot to say. So in her words, she believes that the legislation is, and I'll quote here, wide open to abuse by activists. She alleges that freedom of speech and belief are at an end in Scotland if the accurate description of biological sex is deemed criminal. So that bit about the accurate description of biological sex that J.K. Rowling's talking about there, so that's a term used by a group, including Rowling, who describe themselves as gender-critical feminists. Other people would describe them as anti-trans activists. We're not going to weigh in on that either way. But in a very long social media post, Rowling listed a number of trans women, some of them who are high-profile TV personalities and activists, and concluded the post by calling them men.
Right.
She then went on to say, and I quote, "I'm currently out of the country, but if what I've written here qualifies as an offence under the terms of the new Act, I look forward to being arrested when I return to the birthplace of the Scottish Enlightenment."
So she's kind of putting out a challenge to authorities there.
And to her 14 million followers
on
X.
So is she in handcuffs?
She's not. The police have said that while they've had referrals about J.K. Rowling, that they won't be taking action against her.
Right.
And speaking to the BBC, the First Minister in Scotland, I think, tried to use this as an example of how he could provide further examples of how this law will work. So he said to the BBC, "J.K. Rowling's tweets may well be offensive, upsetting and insulting to trans people, but it doesn't mean that they meet a threshold of criminality of being threatening or abusive or intending to stir up hatred." So there the First Minister is trying to very clearly designate where the law will be used and where it won't be. Obviously, this is just one very high-profile case that J.K. Rowling has herself asked for the police to weigh in on. Each case won't look the same, but it's definitely a fascinating piece of legislation, and the time it's taken and the response it's gotten, it'll be really interesting to see what happens from here.
A very interesting discussion there, and it'll be interesting to see and to track those numbers in terms of how many hate crimes are reported and subsequently how many charges are laid in Scotland, and how that weighs up in terms of the previous year's records, to look at the impact of those laws. Thanks for that, Zara. And thank you for joining us on the Daily Oz this morning. Before we leave, if you're in the mood for a game, well,
who isn't?
It's funny that, because we have just launched a game. And every day we do 3 little riddles in an emoji game that we've called Picture This. We've been getting some amazing feedback about this game. It's caused a little bit of tension in the office, but some healthy tension, I think. And
competition.
And we'd love our podcast family to have a play. I'll throw a link to the game in today's show notes. We hope you enjoy it and let us know what you think.